Cindy has never been good at running. Not from the chores that Minnie, the terrifying head housekeeper, piled onto her thin shoulders every morning. Not from the demands of her friends in the kitchen who knew she was too helpful to ever say no. And she certainly wasn't good at running from a dare, especially one fueled by 3 glasses of golden wine and a sweltering summer heat that made her brain feel like honey. But tonight, as she stumbles through the gnarled, dark roots of the forest edge, Cindy is running for her life. She is a splash of blood-red fabric against the midnight shadows, clutching a heavy burlap sack over her head as tears track through the dirt on her face. Her breath is a ragged sob because she knows what is behind her. A hand cold and strong as iron clamps onto her arm, spinning her around. She looks up, gasping, into the face of Alpha King Daryl. He stands like a monument of dark velvet and jagged gold, his crown shimmering under the moon. His blonde hair is sharp, but his eyes are sharper, burning with a possessive fury that says he hasn't just caught a fugitive. He's caught his mate. None of this would have happened if Cindy had just learned that no was a complete sentence. It started 10 days ago during the palace celebration. Between the heat wave and the flowing wine, Cindy's dependable nature finally snapped. When Ella dared her to do something daring for once, Cindy didn't just say yes. She wandered into the restricted West Wing. There, in a set of chambers that smelled of cedar and power, she found a steaming, luxurious bath already drawn. Dazed by the wine and the humidity, she did the unthinkable. She stripped off her apron and climbed in. She was drifting off to sleep when a growl vibrated through the very water. Standing over her was a mountain of muscle, a man who looked like a weapon carved from marble. Alpha King Daryl, the murderous king. Any sane maid would have screamed. Any smart girl would have begged for mercy. But Cindy, with the wine still buzzing in her veins, simply leaned her head back against the marble, looked him dead in the eye and whispered, "You're late. I've been waiting for you to claim what's yours." She didn't know then that her face was a mirror image of the woman he was supposed to marry. She didn't know that the Princess Rose would use that mistake to blackmail her into a game of treason. And she certainly didn't know that by the time she fled the village at midnight, she wouldn't just be a maid in a red dress. She would be the only woman capable of calming the beast beneath the king's crown. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know if our story goes as far as America, Australia, United Kingdom, and Africa. Chapter 1. The air in the palace kitchens was thick with the scent of roasting meats and the yeasty tang of ale, but it was the golden wine from the southern provinces that proved to be Cindy's undoing. Normally, Cindy was the girl who stayed late to scrub the heavy iron pots, the one who always carried the extra load of linens without a word of complaint. She was dependable Cindy, the maid who lived in the shadow of her own helpfulness. But as the servants' celebration roared into its 4th hour, the heat of the summer night and the 3rd glass of that shimmering honey-sweet wine began to unravel the knots of her restraint. When Ella, her face flushed with mischief, leaned over and whispered that Cindy was too gray to ever do anything worth remembering, the wine whispered back. It told Cindy that she could be vibrant. It told her that she could be daring. Giggling against the rim of her glass, Cindy accepted the dare that would change the trajectory of her life. She was to find the most forbidden place in the castle and leave a mark of her presence, just to prove she had been there. Chapter 2. The corridors of the West Wing were silent, draped in shadows that felt like velvet against her skin. Cindy's feet, usually heavy with the fatigue of a 12-hour shift, felt light as air. She didn't notice the transition from the stone floors of the servant quarters to the plush, deep crimson carpets of the royal wing. Her wine-soaked brain only registered a door left slightly ajar, venting a cloud of steam that smelled of cedarwood, expensive oils, and something primal. Inside, the chamber was a cathedral of marble and moonlight. A massive sunken bath, already filled to the brim with steaming, fragrant water, sat in the center of the room like an invitation. Cindy didn't think about the treasonous nature of her intrusion. She didn't think about Minnie's inevitable wrath. She only thought about how the water looked like liquid silk. With fumbled fingers, she cast aside her stained apron and rough cotton shift, sliding into the heat with a sigh that bordered on a purr. The luxury was intoxicating, far more than the wine, and she let her head fall back against the cool marble rim, closing her eyes as the steam turned her world into a blur of golden contentment. A low, guttural vibration, not quite a voice but a sound that hummed through the very water, shattered her peace. Cindy's eyes snapped open. Standing at the edge of the bath was a man who looked like he had been forged from shadow and moonlight. He was a mountain of muscle, his chest broad and scarred, his presence so heavy it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. It was Alpha King Darryl, the murderous king whose reputation for ruthlessness made even the highest lords tremble. He was wrapped in a simple black robe that hung open, revealing the raw power of a predator. His eyes, a piercing molten amber, narrowed as they swept over her. A growl started deep in his chest, a sound that should have sent her running for her life. "What?" he rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "Are you doing in my chambers?" Any sane woman would have scrambled for her clothes and begged for a quick execution. But Cindy, her inhibitions drowned in golden wine, only felt a strange magnetic pull toward the man. She didn't see a killer, she saw a lonely, magnificent storm. She leaned her head back, her wet hair spilling over the marble, and looked him dead in the eye with a languid, heartbreaking smile. "You're late," she whispered, her voice a soft challenge in the quiet room. "I've been waiting for you to claim what's yours." The silence that followed was thick enough to suffocate, broken only by the king's ragged intake of breath. He didn't call the guards. He didn't strike her. He simply stared at her with a look of such profound shock and sudden burning hunger that Cindy felt the heat of it more than the water. But before the moment could consume them, the sound of approaching footsteps in the outer hall snapped the tension. Panic, sharp and cold, finally pierced through the wine. Cindy scrambled out of the bath, grabbed her clothes in a frantic heap, and vanished through a servant's passage just as the heavy main doors began to groan open. Chapter 3. The morning brought a headache that felt like a physical weight and a reality that was far worse. Cindy was back in her rough apron, scrubbing the floors of the grand gallery, when a hand clamped onto her shoulder. She turned, expecting Minnie, but found herself staring into a face that was almost her own. It was Princess Rose. The resemblance was uncanny, the same dark hair, the same curve of the jaw, but where Cindy's eyes were soft with kindness, the princess's were sharp with cold calculation. Rose didn't waste time. She had seen Cindy fleeing the West Wing, and she had seen the king's reaction when he emerged from his chambers later that night, looking like a man haunted by a ghost. "You were in his room," Rose hissed, her voice a sharp blade. "And he thinks you are me. My father wants this alliance, but I want my freedom. You will play the part of the fiancé. You will go to his dinners, you will wear my silks, and you will make him hate you. If you refuse, I will tell the guards exactly who was lounging in the king's bath. They call it treason, Cindy. They hang girls like you for less." Chapter 4. Trapped between the gallows and a lie, Cindy was forced into a world of lace and lies. That evening she was poured into a gown of midnight blue, her face painted to mask the exhaustion of a maid. She was sat across from Darryl at a table that felt a mile long, surrounded by the opulence of the royal dining hall. Her instructions from Rose were clear. Be uncultured, be demanding, be so repulsive that the king would beg to break the engagement. As the first course was served, Cindy threw the etiquette manual out of the window. She reached for her wine with the wrong hand, she spoke with her mouth half full of pheasant, and she demanded that the windows be thrown open because the rooms smelled of old dogs. She waited for the explosion, for the king to sneer at her lack of breeding. Instead, Darryl watched her with an intensity that made her skin itch. When she accidentally knocked over a crystal goblet, splashing wine across the white linen, he didn't scold her. He simply reached out, his large hand covering her trembling one, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The court is full of statues, Rose," he said, his voice dropping to a private, intimate register. "They are all so perfect, so practiced. And your lack of formality. Utterly enchanting. It's the first honest thing I've seen in this palace in years." Cindy felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly choked her. He was falling for a girl who didn't exist, while the girl who did exist was falling for the very man she was supposed to be sabotaging. Chapter 5. The charade grew more dangerous with every passing hour. A few days later, the king requested a walk through the private gardens. Rose had insisted on a corset so tight Cindy could barely draw a full breath, hoping the discomfort would make her irritable. The sun was high and the air was still, the scent of blooming jasmine heavy enough to be cloying. As they walked, Darryl spoke of his kingdom, of the burdens of his crown, and the loneliness that came with being an alpha. The lack of oxygen and the intensity of his gaze finally took their toll. The world began to tilt, the greenery of the gardens blurring into a hazy smear. Cindy's knees buckled and she felt herself sliding toward the gravel path. Before she could hit the ground, Darryl's arms were around her, catching her with a strength that was both terrifying and comforting. He didn't call for a physician. With a muttered curse, he pulled a small dagger from his belt and, with surgical precision, sliced the laces of her bodice. The relief was instantaneous. Cindy gasped, her lungs filling with sweet, cool air as the restrictive silk fell away. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a mixture of vulnerability and truth. Darryl was looking down at her, his face inches from hers. The mask of the murderous king had fallen away, leaving only a man who was desperately, hopelessly drawn to the soul he felt beneath the disguise. He didn't ask for permission. He leaned down, his mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that was soul-searing and desperate. It wasn't a king claiming a princess. It was a wolf finding his fated mate in the middle of a lie, and for a moment the gardens, the treason, and the village they were soon to flee disappeared into the heat of their shared breath. When Darryl led Cindy to the grand piano, his eyes were soft, expecting a masterpiece. Cindy took a deep breath and crashed her hands onto the ivory keys. The sound was a discordant, jarring mess that echoed painfully against the vaulted ceilings. She played with a frantic, clumsy energy, hitting every wrong note possible, her shoulders hunched as she waited for him to recoil in disgust. But the silence that followed her final, ugly chord wasn't cold. She felt the bench dip as Darryl sat beside her. He didn't mock her. Instead, he reached out and played a single, perfect note in the high register. "I have spent my life surrounded by people who perform for me, Cindy," he whispered, using the name he believed was hers. "They play perfectly because they are terrified. But you play as if you are trying to fight the very instrument. I am bewitched by your chaos. I am bewitched by every strange, unpredictable piece of you." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, and Cindy realized with a sinking heart that her failures were only anchoring him closer to her soul. Chapter 7. The victory of his affection felt like a death sentence. Back in the servants' quarters that night, Rose was waiting in the shadows, her face twisted with a mixture of jealousy and malice. She had heard of the king's growing devotion and decided it was time to end the fantasy. "You actually think he loves you?" Rose laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "He loves a crown. He loves the woman he thinks will bring him an alliance. Do you think for 1 second a man of his power would look twice at a girl who smells of lye and dishwater? To him you are nothing. You are a tool, a placeholder. If he found out the truth, he wouldn't kiss you, he would have you erased from existence." The words acted like a slow-acting poison, seeping into Cindy's heart. She looked at her red, chapped hands and then at the silk gown draped over the chair. Rose was right. The fated bond she felt was a lie built on a foundation of stolen identity. The Alpha King Darryl didn't love Cindy the maid. He loved the shadow of a princess. The hope that had begun to bloom in her chest withered instantly, replaced by a cold, numbing dread. Chapter 8. The next morning, Darryl found her in the library, his expression open and vulnerable, ready to speak of a future that Cindy knew could never happen. Before he could utter a single word of devotion, Cindy forced herself to become the monster he needed her to be. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling but hard. She looked away from his molten amber eyes, afraid that if she met them she would break. "I don't love you, Darryl. There is someone else. Someone from my past. I only went along with this for my father's sake, but I can't stand the sight of you anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. She heard the sharp, ragged intake of his breath. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy, charged with a dark, violent energy. Daryl didn't roar, he shattered. The rejection of a fated mate was a physical agony for an alpha, a wound that struck at the very core of his sanity. His eyes turned a dark, unreadable gold and a low, terrifying growl escaped his throat, a sound that wasn't human. He turned and stormed from the room, the sheer force of his grief causing the glass in the windows to vibrate. By nightfall, word had spread through the palace. The king had lost his mind to the beast, shifting into his massive wolf form and fleeing into the dark woods in a fit of primal rage. Chapter 9. Terrified that her lie had destroyed the man she loved and certain that the truth would soon be discovered, Cindy knew she had to leave. At midnight, as the village slept under a heavy shroud of clouds, she packed a meager sack with her old maid's shift and a loaf of bread. She donned her vibrant red dress, the only thing she still owned that made her feel like the woman Daryl had kissed, and slipped out of the palace gates. The forest was a labyrinth of shifting shadows and gnarled roots. Every snap of a twig sounded like a death knell. She ran until her lungs burned, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she wasn't alone. Deep in the darkness she heard it, the heavy rhythmic thud of paws and the low, continuous growl of a predator. Daryl was hunting. His wolf, driven mad by the scent of the mate who had rejected him, was stalking her through the trees. She could feel his golden gaze on her back, a physical weight that made her stumble. Chapter 10. She reached the forest's edge where the trees gave way to a steep ravine and found herself trapped. A massive shadow detached itself from the oaks. Daryl stood before her, having shifted back into his human form, though he was barely recognizable. His velvet coat was torn, his crown was gone, and his eyes were wild and unfocused, glowing with a predatory light. He pinned her against a tree, his hand clamping onto her arm with an iron grip that spoke of a desperate, unbreakable claim. "Why?" he rasped, his voice a raw, bleeding edge of pain. "Why would you run from your own soul?" The weight of the sack she carried fell to the ground, spilling her old, stained apron onto the grass. Cindy looked up at him, her face wet with tears of pure anguish. "Because I'm not a princess," she sobbed, the truth finally tearing out of her. "I'm a nobody, Daryl. I'm a maid who cleans your floors and sleeps in the hay. I'm the girl who stumbled into your bath because she was too drunk to know better. You don't love me, you love a lie. I ran because I couldn't bear to see you hate me when you finally saw the truth." Daryl froze. His gaze dropped to the rough apron at her feet and then back to her tear-stained face. The wildness in his eyes didn't vanish, but it changed. It softened into something even more intense. He leaned in, his breath hot against her skin, his mouth inches from the pulse point at her neck. "I knew the moment I smelled the wine and the soap in that bath," he whispered, his voice vibrating through her entire body. "I didn't choose a title, Cindy. My wolf chose you. I don't care about the floors you clean. I care about the soul that kept me sane in a palace of vipers." He tilted her head back, his eyes boring into hers with an alpha's command. "I am dying from the hole you left in my chest. If you want to save me, if you want to be mine, then stop running." He pressed her hand against his neck, over the mark of his lineage. "Claim me, Cindy. Bite me and seal our fate, or let the beast take us both." In the moonlit silence of the forest edge, Cindy stopped being a maid and stopped being a princess. She reached up, her teeth grazing his skin, and claimed the king who had been hers from the very first drop of golden wine. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know if our story goes as far as America, Australia, United Kingdom and Africa.